God of War is one of the most recognizable game series of all time. The face of the hack and slash genre originally started out as a Devil May Cry clone, but once audiences got to experience and love the story of Kratos, it emerged as its own titan within the gaming industry, overshadowing its original inspiration. Over the past few months, I got the chance to play the original trilogy of God of War, God of War 2, and God of War 3 for myself, and all I can say is, wow, what a series. Every game in this trio has their peaks and valleys, but the series stays strong with a handful of constants across all three titles. Amazing gameplay, memorable moments, and one of the craziest and most epic stories in video game history. Today, we're taking a look at not just one game, but all three games in one video. This is the ultimate God of War trilogy review. Before we start, remember to subscribe. I talk about video games on this channel in an analytical style, so if you like those kind of videos, feel free to join our community. I also live stream from time to time right here on this YouTube channel, so if you want to come hang out, crack some jokes, or discuss stuff, feel free to join us sometime. If you can't make it to the streams live, feel free to subscribe to my second channel, RatedEm Live. I upload all the best moments from my live streams onto there. With all that out of the way, let's jump into detail about how this video is going to work. In this video, I'm going to be giving each game a review. I'll look into what makes them good, what makes them not so good, and with the latter two titles, we'll compare them amongst the game or games that came before. I won't be going into the history of the games, like I said, I'm just reviewing them, so without further ado, let's jump into God of War 1. The game that started it all, God of War. As mentioned earlier, this game actually started out as a clone of Devil May Cry, which is honestly surprising to me considering the games don't look that much alike. I mean, yes, they're both hack and slashes, but God of War feels so separate. Let's first discuss the story of the game. In God of War, a Spartan soldier named Kratos is on a quest for vengeance against the god of war named Ares, after he manipulated Kratos into becoming an unstoppable killing machine that led him to unknowingly kill his own family in a blind rage. The story is very straightforward. Just go kill Ares. I think the team wasn't sure if the series was going to pick up or not, so to have a story that was not only simple but could start and end in one game was a pretty smart move. I think that the first few hours of the game are great. Going through Athens is a great introduction to how the flow of the game works, going from combat encounter to puzzle, maybe a platforming section somewhere in there, rinse and repeat. The Athens section introduces enough content at a steady pace to keep the player engaged, and like I said, it demonstrates the game's flow well. However, once you get into the middle of the game is personally where things start to slog. You go from Athens to a desert in order to find the Titan Kronos, who is wandering the desert with the Temple of Pandora on his back. Inside the temple is Pandora's Box, a chest containing all the evils of the world, which Kratos intends to use to defeat Ares. Well, nobody told Kratos that the temple is a long, tedious, and at times repetitive place. You'll have to do these challenges to progress through the temple, oftentimes backtracking or returning to previously visited areas. It gets a little sickening to look at after a while. Another thing about Pandora's Temple is that Kratos is completely alone in this part of the game. There aren't a lot of characters that you interact with during this section, which I think is also why I didn't like it too much. It was way too much gameplay and not enough story experience to balance it out. And this is a big portion of the game. This is like arguably 60% of the game. 60% of the game is Pandora's repetitive, lonely temple. However, the final section when you return to Athens is great. A lot of things introduced at the start of the game begin to fall into place, and of course the final fight against Ares is totally worth the hype. So while the start and end of God of War's story are great, the middle section is where it really trips up in my opinion. However, in the developer's defense, they were probably more focused on engaging the player with gameplay since they didn't know if they were going to get a second chance with a sequel. Speaking of gameplay, let's see what makes it so compelling.
Once attached, the chains remained so, chained and seared to the flesh, a part of the bearer's body, a permanent reminder of Kratos' pledge.
God of War's gameplay is, in my opinion, the ideal hack and slash. Controlling Kratos feels great, it feels powerful, it feels fun. You can feel every swing of the blades of chaos that Kratos makes. They feel heavy and hard-hitting. The animations and sound work perfectly in tandem to illustrate the raw power that the Spartan has as you slice and stab the soldiers of Ares across your journey. Now, I don't want to already start comparing to the games ahead, but this is the least open sandbox when it comes to combat, but let me explain. I personally think the developers were more focused on, hey, let's have Kratos be able to use all these magical abilities inspired by famous Greek mythos, rather than how can we make combos as creative and engaging as possible. So yes, these abilities are fun. It's awesome to freeze people with the head of Medusa. It's fun to use Poseidon's Rage, but you can't really integrate them into your combos like you can with later games. I also personally think that they perfected progression in the original game. Collect red orbs to power up your weapons and powers, gaining new perks to each one with each level. Collectibles will upgrade your health and magic meters, and they're placed around the game world enough that I managed to upgrade both meters twice without purposefully having to go out of my way to explore hidden areas or anything. In God of War, if you're not fighting enemies, you're doing puzzles, and the puzzles in this game are pretty decent. Like I said earlier, the first couple of areas going through Athens are unique and feature short, varying puzzles, but Pandora's Temple is where the puzzles start to get repetitive and even at times frustrating. There's a few really fun puzzles in the temple, but a majority of them aren't as good in my opinion. Before we finish up, I do want to talk about the treasures in this game. The game comes with a handful of videos discussing the game's development, showing off early builds of the game, and even cut levels. There's even a room you can access after finishing the game that features a bunch of unused character models for enemies and even Kratos. I love this. I'm a huge sucker for learning about unreleased games or cut content in games or early builds of games, and God of War just features all of that inside the final version of the game. It's such a little treat. I love it so much. I personally think that God of War 1 is the weakest entry in the series. However, I think this is because the developers were testing the waters and playing it safe. Like I mentioned, this game was a clone of Devil May Cry. It wasn't really intended to be a big deal. But to say that backfired is an understatement, as God of War would be praised by critics and fans alike. God of War 2 is very much like Halo 2 in my opinion. While the first game laid the groundwork, God of War 2 took that groundwork and built upon it to create a game that feels like a sequel and not just an expansion. A reformed combat system, new powers, new movement options, and even more epic story, God of War 2 is a perfect sequel. The story takes place years after Kratos usurped the throne from Ares. He's a ruthless and violent god of war, and the rest of the gods aren't happy with him. Zeus forms a plan to put Kratos down and stop his unrelenting anger, luring him into giving up his godly powers into a weapon called the Blade of Olympus. Before we continue, I just want to comment that this is a great way to quote-unquote reset the game. The opening level of God of War 2 lets you play as a fully upgraded Kratos, and to bring Kratos down for the player to level him up across the game, you have to drain his godly powers into the sword. It makes perfect sense within the story, and it plays into the gameplay. I love this. Anyways, Zeus ends up using this sword to kill Kratos. While he's on his way to the depths of hell, he's pulled aside by Gaia, a titan of Earth, who tells him that the ancient titans are out for revenge against Zeus just as much as Kratos is. Zeus defeated them in a war long ago in order to reign over the gods and humans, and they want vengeance. Gaia tells Kratos that he must travel to the island of creation to seek out the Sisters of Fate, and turn back time to stop Zeus from killing him. This story is already on a more grand scale than its predecessor. Sure, killing a god was a pretty big and epic task, but to go back in time and rewrite history by preventing your own death, that's pretty good. Let's start talking about the game's pacing by discussing its opening level. As I mentioned earlier, you start off as a fully upgraded Kratos, which lets the player really get a grip on what kind of game this is going to be. It's almost like you're playing a demo and this is the game telling you this is what you can become. It's a great hook. And again, as I already mentioned, the way that they nerf Kratos is amazing in my opinion, as it writes into the story and applies it into the physical game. I love it. Let's do a really big jump to when you're on the island of creation. I know I'm skipping over like an entire area of the game, but I find that a lot of these videos are just story recaps at times, and I don't want that to happen, so I'm just going to jump to the point in the game to continue my argument about pacing. The island of creation is 10 times better than Pandora's Temple. The island features plenty of different areas for you to see, which avoids the point I made earlier with the first game that it looks a lot the same. While I do think a lot of these areas are filler areas, they aren't really tedious, and they do give you something new to look at for a bit. I just think these filler areas could have been taken out of the game and nothing really would have changed. The elements featured in these areas could have been relocated to a different area that has a bit more weight in the story, and the overall length of the game could have been cut down, but I'll get to that in a second. The first area that comes to mind when it comes to filler areas is the Bog of the Forgotten. Sure, you learn about secondary weapons and you get the Golden Fleece, which is a very important item, but I think these could have been moved to other areas and the devs could have cut the Bog of the Forgotten out with no drastic changes to the story. But as I said, these areas that are more so just filler areas, they're not really tedious and they do give you something new to look at. They do just extend the game's length. God of War 1 is an 8 to 10 hour romp. God of War 2, however, is around 10 to 12 hours long. I know it's only an extra 2 hours, but good lord, this game felt way longer than it needed to be. I'm not the biggest fan of long games, so this is an extremely personal irk for me, but I still thought I'd bring it up. Aside from that, I think God of War 2's journey is way better than the first one. The first game was Kratos having to go somewhere and then go back to fight Ares. This game is Kratos having to cross this huge island to get to one goal, which I find is a lot more satisfying. Getting to Pandora's box in the first game was realistically only half the battle. In God of War 2, however, you're doing what you need to do in one take, which feels a lot better in my opinion. And the ending of the game is so much better too. Sure, it was cool to fight a god, but to fight the god of gods, Zeus, yeah, that's dope. The boss fight is also way better in my opinion. It feels like a brawl between two equally matched opponents. Plus, you get to use the Blade of Olympus, which is awesome. And the finale of the game is just as good as the final battle, where Athena sacrifices herself to save Zeus, and Kratos learns that he's actually Zeus' son. Angry at the fact that he didn't get his revenge, Kratos goes back in time to the war between the Titans and the gods to bring the Titans into the present to fight against the already crumbling Olympus. The game leaves off on a cliffhanger where we see Kratos and the Titans making their way to take down Zeus once and for all. The final fight, cliffhanger ending, it's all so good, I love it. Stepping away from talking about the story, let's talk gameplay. God of War 2 isn't just a continuation of the first game. The sequel introduces multiple new features, plus puts a new coat of paint on some old features as well. Before I even discuss what's new, I want to talk about the feel of combat in God of War 2. Remember how I said it felt good to attack enemies as Kratos in the first game? Well, the second game has new animations and new sounds and new effects that illustrate the raw power the Ghost of Sparta has. Let's take a look at the spin attack from the first game. And now let's take a look at the second one. The second one just has way more power behind it. Like, he's not just spinning the Blades of Chaos around, he is swinging those motherfuckers. When you go to kill a Minotaur, it's a new animation. The Gorgons, it's a new animation. And they're all so much better than the old ones. Now let's dive into the new features. There's new movement options, such as being able to swing from hooks, and later in the game you get the Wings of Icarus, which allow you to glide across caverns or fly upwards if you're underneath a draft of wind. In terms of new combat features, holy shit, there's new combat features. New combos to unlock with the Blades of Athena. There's a new magics to unlock and use. There's sub-weapons now. There's a lot. The Blades of Chaos get swapped out for the Blades of Athena, with some new combos to unlock as you level it up. However, a lot of combos from the previous games stick around to make the Blades of Athena a cornerstone for players to come back to. I really want to talk about the new magic abilities in God of War 2. In the first game, I mentioned that the magic abilities aren't great for combos, and it felt more like the developers were trying to cram in as many references to Greek mythos as they could. While I think that the references are a bit more nuanced, being references to titans more than gods, the gameplay aspect of magic abilities in God of War 2 is way better. They're way easier to integrate into combos than the magic abilities of the first game. You can be doing a combo, fire a few arrows from Typhon's Bane, create a few charges of Kronos Rage, have those go off while you're swinging out more attacks with the Blades of Athena. It all feels so fluid and smooth. Rage of the Gods has also been replaced with Titan Rage, which also has its own combos and moves to be unlocked. God of War 2 also builds upon the Blade of Artemis introduced in the last game, and develops it into a completely new system, introducing 3 new weapons. Those being the Barbarian Hammer, the Spear of Destiny, and of course the Blade of Olympus. All 3 can be upgraded to unlock new moves as well. There is a lot of depth to this game. Like, that's all just the combat. There's the Wings of Icarus, there's the Golden Fleece. Both are more for puzzle solving, but they're still new additions. Speaking of puzzles, they're a bit more reliant on the tools Kratos has at his disposal, which I don't really think is good or bad. They still feel like God of War puzzles, and honestly, I just don't have much to say about the puzzles. I think they're alright. Overall, God of War 2 is an ideal sequel. It steps up the game in every aspect compared to the first title, the story is on a more grand scale, and the gameplay is revolutionized. But where God of War 2 revolutionizes the formula, God of War 3 perfects it. God of War 3 is a masterpiece. When people think of God of War, they think of the ruthless gore, the incredible feats and moments, the iconic characters, and it's all because of this game. God of War 3 is God of War. The finale of the overarching story is firing on all cylinders. With a phenomenal story and some of the best and most deep gameplay the series has seen, this is the ultimate God of War experience.
Zeus! Your son has returned. I bring the destruction of Olympus!
In the first 30 minutes, you take down Poseidon. You kill the god of the seas by beating to a pulp and crushing his eyes with your thumbs. This should be enough to let you know what kind of game God of War 3 is going to be. God of War 3, in my opinion, is the only true mature God of War title. This is the most brutal the gore has been, but I'll get to that as I discuss where it's relative. God of War 3 just feels like it takes itself more seriously. It doesn't feel like a video game, but more like an experience, and I know that sounds really corny, but it's true. The tone of the game just feels more mature, and I'm a big fan. Before I jump into the story, I gotta address the biggest thing about God of War 3 for me, the graphics. Yes, I'm playing the PS4 remaster, but here's footage of the PS3 original. It looks amazing, especially when you compare it to God of War 2. And now here's the PS3 original compared to my emulated God of War 2 with a custom HD texture pack and a handful of settings to bump up the render resolution. It still looks better, and fuck it, let's throw in the PS4 remaster. This game is beautiful, and I think that's why I feel the way I do about the tone. It doesn't have to utilize an exaggerated art style to stand out. God of War 3 uses the power of the PS3 to generate beautiful, realistic imagery. It's this realistic look that makes the game feel a lot more serious compared to the other two. Alright, let's finally discuss the game itself. God of War 3 picks up right where God of War 2 ends. Kratos and the Titans from the past are climbing up Mount Olympus to take down Zeus once and for all. After killing Poseidon, Kratos and Gaia make it to the top, but Zeus knocks them off with ease. As Gaia and Kratos struggle to hold on, she reveals to him that Kratos was manipulated by the Titans, and he was nothing more to them than a pawn to get them closer to Zeus. Kratos falls into the pits of the realm of Hades, and declares war against not only the gods of Olympus, but the Titans who betrayed him. Once Kratos falls into Hades, he lands in the river Styx, and this is how the game nerfs you. Compared to God of War 2, I prefer the previous game's way of nerfing Kratos. I didn't even realize it on my first playthrough that my health and magic were being reduced. It's just not as memorable as draining your godly powers into the Blade of Olympus. In Hades, Kratos meets the ghost of Athena, who has recognized Zeus's unjust fears against Kratos. She sides with the ghost of Sparta, acting as his guide across the final stretch of his journey for revenge. She gives him the Blades of Exile, an upgraded form of his Blades of Athena. Now this just may seem like a new coat of paint on the mostly unchanged cornerstone weapon of the series, but there's a lot more to this. The Blades of Exile are actually a really great introduction as to how magic works in God of War 3. Weapons and magic are now homogenized. Each weapon you obtain has a magic ability attached to it, rather than having them separately. I originally was a little unhappy with this change, but as the game progressed, I learned to like it. Especially when we see the introduction of tools, but more on that later. It kind of gives you more reason to use the alternate weapons. I mean, each weapon having unique moves is fine enough, but I think attaching the magics to the weapons gives another use to them. I think this was beneficial. I want to use the Claws of Hades soul summon ability, and I end up using the Claws of Hades as a melee weapon for a bit because of the convenience. There's still a magic meter, but magic items are now replaced with tools, which have their own meter. The tools in the game are Apollo's bow, which works like Typhon's bane, the head of Helios, and the boots of Hermes. Each tool has its own uses, even outside of combat. And if you're wondering about the Blade of Olympus, you can use it when you enable Spartan Rage. It has its own magic ability too. Also, everything from the last game, the Icarus Wings, the Golden Fleece, Poseidon's Trident, they're all available at the start of the game. Unfortunately, the Amulet of the Fates does not get utilized. I think giving everything to Kratos obviously makes sense, considering that the game takes place immediately after God of War 2. And going right from one game to the next, it's fine, but honestly, I feel like this is a lot to throw at the player if this is their first God of War title. If there's anyone who's played God of War 3 first before the other games, let me know in the comments if you were overwhelmed with the amount of utilities you had access to at the start. I want to know what it's like to just be thrown all this stuff and told to have at it. As I mentioned earlier, God of War 3 is God of War at its peak. This is the game that people think of when they think of the series. When people think of the gore and the brutality of God of War, they're thinking of this game. When they think of the crazy feats Kratos has accomplished, it's this game. The amount of iconic moments in this game and how fucking awesome they are is through the roof. I mean, tearing off Helios' head for your own use, killing the massive Titan Kronos, and my personal favorite, the Hercules fight. The Hercules fight is nothing special gameplay-wise, but it feels amazing. It feels like two gladiators duking it out. It feels like a UFC match, and the cutscene before it is just, I don't know, man, I love it.
Hello, brother. This is not between us, Hercules.
Isn't it? You were always Zeus's favorite.
Think about it, brother. While I was stuck cleaning the Augean stables, he chose you to destroy Ares. While you were being crowned the God of War, I was sent to find an apple. They called them labors. Ha! Perhaps he did allow me to kill the Nemean lion, but he made your name known amongst the people. A fierce warrior, a killer made hero, a man made a god. But this time, brother, this time I will destroy you. Call it my 13th and final labor. Soon I will become the God of War and claim the throne for myself.
God of War 3 is the final game in the original trilogy, and the finale of what you could call the young Kratos saga. And the ending of the game is, in my opinion, amazing. After Kratos finally kills Zeus, Athena comes to the conclusion that when the evils of the world were locked inside Pandora's box, she placed the power of hope within the box as a sort of backup plan. Turns out this is what Kratos used to defeat Ares, and all the other evils were released into the world alongside it. These evils affected Zeus, who got paranoid that Kratos would attempt to overthrow him as he tried to do with his father Kronos. So Zeus stepped in to prevent his own downfall, which would end up causing his own downfall. This explains why Zeus went after Kratos to begin with. Athena then tries to manipulate Kratos into giving up the power of hope to her, but instead of submitting to the gods, Kratos sacrifices himself to release hope to all of humanity. This is a beautiful arc for the character. Going from someone who's lost in their past, to someone who had a raging hatred for the gods, to someone who realizes the many mistakes of their life and releases the power of hope to humanity so that they may not fall into the same hell he had. God of War 3 is an amazing game by itself, but when coupled with the rest of the games in the series, it makes it even better. It's the most complete God of War game in the trilogy, even with its small hiccups. God of War 3 is God of War. With every game individually reviewed, let's take a look at which ones shine the best in certain aspects. Let's first talk about story. While the God of War trilogy's overarching story is amazing, don't get me wrong, not all the individual stories of the games are equal. God of War 1's story is very to the point, and I don't mind it, but as I mentioned, it's very simplistic, most likely due to the developers not even knowing if the game would take off. However, I can give God of War 1 props for being a complete and contained story. If you were to only play God of War 1 and not touch the others, I don't think you would have any unanswered questions. The ending cutscene implies that Kratos watches over future wars. Although when you compare it to the stories of God of War 2 and 3, it feels like it plays it a little too safe. And while I think God of War 3 is the most complete game in the trilogy, I think the story only works because of the previous two games, especially the ending regarding how Pandora's box worked in the first game. God of War 2 is, in my opinion, the best individual story. The time travel themes and the idea of being against not just one god but all of them, it's ambitious and exciting. Like I said, I like the contained story of the first game, and I like the way the third game caps the bottle. But God of War 2 is just a great balance between the two. You do end up finishing your goal of going back in time to fight Zeus, but it also sets up the epic finale of God of War 3 and keeps you excited. For gameplay, it is easily God of War 3. I did say that the game feels a little bloated, and I agree with that. I think that if this is by chance your first God of War experience, I think the third game offers way too much to new players. But if you're hot off the heels of God of War 2 like I was, this is peak God of War. This is Kratos at his peak. And I think the fact that you have everything and it's not stripped from you really strengthens the bridge between 2 and 3. It feels like God of War 3 starts 5 minutes after God of War 2's ending. Not only do you have everything from the previous game, but they still found ways to add new features to the game and improve upon older ones. It truly is the most complete God of War game in terms of gameplay. If I had to put them in order, taking everything into account, I think I put God of War 2 at number 1, God of War 3 at number 2, and God of War 1 at number 3. As I've said a billion times, yes, God of War 3 is the most complete title, but not only is 2's story the best in my opinion, it really does feel like a sequel with the way it builds upon previous features, like more ambitious magic powers, the time manipulation, sub-weapons, etc. Overall, the God of War trilogy still holds up today. It's one of the best trilogies in video game history in my opinion, and if you haven't played it, I highly recommend playing them. I want to give a huge shout out to the IGN guides that came out when these games released. Honestly, I would not have been able to do like God of War 1 and 2 without the fucking IGN guides from the mid-2000s. Big ups to those who wrote them back in the day. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Aside from that, that's it. That's all for me. I hope you guys enjoyed. Subscribe, leave a like. This is probably one of my most ambitious videos. So if you want to leave a like and subscribe and comment, greatly appreciated. Thanks, everyone.